and of course you're welcome to question them at that point. Mr. Peter Kensington will then speak to the matters of the moment, the landscape, rural character and amenity effects, after which, sir, I will address several points in terms of the planning context. So that's the intention at this point.
That sounds fine to me, thank you.
Okay, it's probably worth Pat or Nadia, if they're present, to just raise the specific concerns or questions they have at this point, just around the engineering matters, and obviously open for questions, sir, as you see fit.
So, it says Pat S on the screen, but give me your surname if you would, sir.
It's Pat Segru, sir.
And your role at council is?
I'm a development engineer.
Right. Oh, let me have it.
Okay. So first, we'd like to just comment on the roading side of things, and that would be in response to Dean Scanlon's evidence. First of all, we accept his intersection proposal, but we'd like to still hold the point where we would like to see footpaths on both sides. So we'd like to see an addition to the proposed road design of having a footpath which would come from the access to Hurupaki down to the access of the James on that development northern side, and they would match the existing widths. So I think the minimum we have on the E's currently with engineering standards is 1.4, but they have already done a footpath from the access of the James down to Hurupaki school, so we'd like to see that width matched up to the new development from the James.
Anything else, sir?
Yes, sir. And this is just on the behalf of Parks and Recreation. We have had discussions with Melissa, but we'd like to see these backed up in an engineering sort of design so that there's clarification. There is a walkway proposed to go along the larger lot frontages, sort of, I think it's lot 76 to 71 through lot 205. It has shown in, I think it's an early earthworks plan where there's a forebay for the stormwater retention pond on lot 204. These intersect each other. I know that the forebay post-construction and earthworks phase will be removed, but the stormwater retention pond that is to remain still requires a forebay, and that forebay will require maintenance. So we just also want to have sort of conditions through engineering design to show that there's a construction or a design in there that will ensure that those two won't conflict with each other, so that the forebay will be able to be maintained access, but also that walkway won't intercept in a negative way. So there's a way to mitigate against that. And then one additional thing, there is an access that is meant to be coming through the bottom of the James, which is a maintenance access for the proposed playground. We have spoken to the surveyor who's done the design, and that's to be 3 meters wide and sufficient to withstand the loading of a light vehicle. But we just want to see this easement and legal access formed in accordance to that. And that would be it, sir.
Well, that's all very clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you
Sir.
for taking the time out to give us your time.
You're welcome.
Sir, I think Mr. Aaron Holland was itching to get in there with a comment, perhaps to respond to those questions. Am I right, Mr. Holland?
Yes, you are. I can address some of those right now, if you'd like me to.
I'm happy for that.
Hi, I'm Aaron Holland. I'm the design engineer. So there seems to be a bit of confusion. The forebay that's shown that Parks are talking about is a temporary thing for the erosion sediment control. It's got nothing to do with the stormwater pond design at all. The forebay for that is contained within the design drawings that were submitted by me. The two are being confused, so that won't affect what they're talking about. And the other one is the access across the stream as part of the James has already been vested to council as a reserve. So council already owns that piece of land as part of the James development. And there's a culvert crossing across the stream that's been installed that has had big trucks going across it. So it's more than suitable as an access to the pond. So I think there's a misunderstanding as to what's been submitted as part of the plans, like the difference between the erosion sediment control plans and the actual final design. The two are not the same thing. Yeah, that's all I think I should, yeah. I haven't got anything else to add to that, but I think there's a misunderstanding in the reading of the plans is a lot of the problem. Because it will achieve what Parks wants, and half of it's there already, and I think they've misinterpreted the plans that have been submitted.
I wonder if we can handle this way, that should consent be granted, and that is not to be assumed yet, whether through Mr. Hartstone we might ensure that required clarity on those issues. Would you be happy to assume that role, Mr. Hartstone?
I've made a note of it, sir. I'm sure it can be picked up. The only slightly complicating factor, sir, is that, of course, should you grant consent, the conditions can only relate to the site of the subdivision. There's nothing that we can impose that would relate to any other land. But nevertheless, conversations can be had. I admit I'm not entirely clear on the context of the issue, but I just make that one point.
Yeah, I think we can handle that in the way that it's ultra vires as a condition that could put in the advice notes, could it not?
I think so long as there's a binding arrangement in some way, shape or form, then it can be dealt with.
Can I also add, as part of the pond's detailed design, they have to provide maintenance access to the forebay and stuff. It's one of the things that'll go through council as part of the engineering plan approval process. So we have to show that you have to be able to get there.
I take it, Mr. Holland, that you two engineers are in different locations by the look of your background. So it's not something you can talk about face to face today.
No, not specifically. Mel has said along the lines of what you said with the talking with council that we will provide that as part of the design. So putting it into the consent is probably okay. But it has to be done anyway, I suppose is what I'm getting at. It can't be built without providing that because that's one of the requirements.
Well, Mr. Huston, I think we'll probably just have to leave that lie on the table until I've heard your evidence in totality. Are you happy to do that?
Yeah, that's fine, sir. There's always a way to make these things work. I got the impression, rightly or wrongly, that some of these connections for services or pedestrian access or otherwise were through the James subdivision. If not, then it's a relatively simple issue. But look, I wonder whether the best way to deal with that might be just through the right of reply. If the applicant can make a note and respond to those clearly and succinctly, then that may end it.
They are, Alistair, through the James subdivision. But what Charlotte has said and what I was trying to say is council now owns that access. It's part of the parks reserve area. It's been vested to them.
Thanks, Aaron.
Well, perhaps you, Mr. Holland, could talk to Ms. Lucas and, if necessary, get her to cover it in the right of reply.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I will get together with Charlotte and both of us will come up with an answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Hartstone, back to you. Oh, by the way, I've just received, courtesy of Ms. Wilson, a supplementary statement of evidence from Mr. Kensington. You're aware of that, I presume?
Yes, sir, I am. Peter's outdone himself in preparing a statement, which makes me look rather second rate, given I won't have a statement to provide to you. So that segues nicely into the time being handed over to Mr. Kensington at this point to hear his views on the application and his position as it stands now.
I'll be very happy to hear from you verbally, because I'm anxious to hear your position given all the evidence which you've heard today. So no embarrassment need felt about doing it verbally. I will have pen and paper at hand. So we go to Mr. Kensington, do we? Welcome to the hearing, sir.
Well, good afternoon, Commissioner, and thank you. I'm not sure that I've appeared before you before.
But never mind, I've read your qualifications and experience and very keen to hear from you.
Very good, thank you. And just to explain, I was hoping to prepare something in writing for you overnight, but given that we're going to get through today, I have put my thoughts in writing because I thought it was easier to work through for all of us, and also just to make sure that I covered everything that I wanted to cover. So that's why I have prepared that supplementary statement, and not to outdo Mr. Hartstone at all. It was really just to be helpful for the process and make sure that everything's nice and clear.
His light will not diminish as a result, I'm sure.
Exactly, I agree. So I just want to make sure that everyone's got a copy of that before I get underway, in particular Ms. Lupus.
Thank you, I do.
Thank you, good.
Just for completeness, is there anybody else who would like a copy who has not got one? It appears not, although Mr. Aaron Holland's hand is still up. I take it that's history, is it? His hand has disappeared, so I assume that's answered that question. So, Mr. Kensington.
Thank you, sir. I'd just like to start at the end, if I may, at my paragraph 4.18. And I'd just like to ngā mihi Ms. Henderson's submission today, and just thank her for that in providing me with more of an understanding of the site's Māori cultural landscape significance and value. I understand that it does have value, and I'd just like to acknowledge that as part of a wider landscape assessment process. So I won't take it any further other than just to acknowledge it.
Thank you. I just see Mr. Farrow's hand has got up. Is there something you want to say at this point? Mr. Farrow, are you hearing us?
Yes, I am. Sorry, sir. I was in danger of giving you another version of Star Wars a short while ago. But I'm just trying to, I believe, have a copy of Mr. Kensington's supplementary, so I'm just making a quick contact with Ms. Lupus and seeing if she can send it to me.
Yes, it's important that you have it, so
It is indeed.
keep that under review.
I have that. That's just come through to me right now, so I'm fine. Thank you.
Excellent. Back to you, Mr. Kensington.
Thank you. So just starting at paragraph 4.1, I agree with many of the points made in Mr. Farrow's evidence. You know, I respect, as a fellow landscape architect, the skills and qualifications and experience of Mr. Farrow. And, you know, every time I read his evidence and his response, I keep questioning my own findings and just really checking in to make sure that what I've provided to you to assist with your decision making is the best that I can do. When I first started looking at this application for review, when I was invited to look at it, my first impression was that this looked like a really sound proposal and appropriate for the site. However, the more I got into it, and in working with Mr. Hartstone, it is really that planning context that we're working within that brings my landscape assessment review into focus. You know, on the face of it, it appears straightforward, but there are some subtleties and complexities in there, which Mr. Hartstone will take you through further later this afternoon. So I find myself in quite a tricky situation, because I do at 4.2 agree that the design of the proposal is well considered and it responds appropriately to the site's landscape opportunities and constraints. And that includes the retirement of the steep existing grazing land and the restoration of this land with revegetation, which in particular will result in significant landscape benefits. I acknowledge that. As long as those areas are maintained in perpetuity in order to achieve the applicant's vision. And I think that's part of what the plan requires, is that it's not just a quick fix, it's something that is there long term and achieves that vision, like I say. Additionally, the restoration of the Waitoa stream corridor is an important landscape feature on the site. That's a very positive aspect of the proposal as well. And working together, I agree with the applicant's decision to do that, I guess. The vesting of those areas and the other areas of open space on the site, and with the provision of future public access through these spaces, is also a positive aspect of the proposal as a whole. And the way that the applicant has approached this as a master plan, again, makes logical sense to me. And we've heard today about that lesser density in the southern portion of the site than what might occur there. And then the northern portion having these larger lots relative to the southern part of the site. And I agree that it would be a missed opportunity to revert back to a standard residential subdivision without the proposed landscape benefits within that southern portion of the site. At 4.6, I also acknowledge that there are costs involved in, the realities of implementing the landscape benefits that are proposed will be significant. And the reality is someone's got to pay for that. And generally that means selling more lots or higher value lots overall to get to that, to make the balance sheet work at the end of the day. So I acknowledge all of that, and it's complex. At 4.7, I also acknowledge Mr. Farrow's exploration of an alternative permitted baseline, although he didn't call it that, he made sure not to. The scenario, you know, with the red shed and the large house up on the hill, and I agree that that would not bring positive landscape outcomes, and would potentially result in greater adverse landscape effects than the proposal. I'm not sure that, you know, I acknowledge Mr. Farrow said that's hypothetical, and we've already got an existing dwelling on that part of the site, and so probably that would mean that existing dwelling would have to be demolished in order to achieve a new dwelling and shed up the top there. But the point is that that has the potential to cause adverse landscape and visual effects, different to what we've got in front of us with the proposal now. At 4.8, there's been some discussion about the fact that, well, this is out the back. You can't really see it from the road. It's going to be screened by houses that are built in the front portion of the site and at the James. I'd just like to caution, you know, when we do landscape assessments, it's not all about visibility. It's also about the change in character of that land, that, you know, it's the land use that'll be changing permanently. And there will be other places in the future from where that part of the site will be more visible. For example, once you're in the site, in the new development, you'll be walking on the tracks, you'll be using the open space areas, and clearly you'll see that northern part of the site, and you'll experience it in a closer proximity than what you do now from publicly accessible places. And I've said that at 4.9. And then just I caution about placing too much weight on the visual simulations as static images from fixed viewpoints to draw strong conclusions of the proposal's landscape effects. They are very helpful, the visual simulations, and Mr. Farrow has done a good job in producing those and communicating the proposal as a whole, but they are just a tool to help us understand landscape effects, and they shouldn't be relied on as the, you know, the silver bullet for making a call on something. So at 4.10, I do acknowledge that they're very helpful, that material. But I did only, when I prepared my original memo and report, I had only seen part of that full package, and they were only in draft form. So now that I've seen them in the round, I think they are very helpful, and especially for you as a decision maker and visualising the proposal. 4.11 is kind of the key thing for me, where I keep coming back to. My assessment of landscape effects is undertaken within the context of the applicable statutory provisions. As I understand it, these provisions anticipate a continuation of rural character with the avoidance of urban character for the northern part of the site. And I'd just like to take you, if I may, to my report, if you've got a copy of that in front of you, and attachment B to that report. Sorry, sir, you're on the mute there.
My apologies. I only have two screens, and so I have to hide your supplementary evidence to find your full evidence in chief.
Apologies.
I will get there. I'm sorry. Be patient.
Thank you. It is important.
I'm with you now. Thank you.
Thank you. I just note that Mr. Farrow has his hand up.
Oh, again, or was that the previous one, Mr. Farrow?
No, it's not showing us up from my end, sir.
Oh, it's showing up here.
Hmm.
Some way we can.
I will click the button again.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay,
You
go
got it. Oh, no, it's come back. Now it's gone.
Right, my apologies.
Hold that position. Thank you. Back to you, Mr. Kensington.
Thank you. So turning to attachment B from my original review report, there has been some criticism from the applicant that I've kind of focused on one or two particular objectives and policies in the plan related, to inform my assessment. But this attachment 2 sets out all of the relevant objectives and policies that I have turned my mind to in order to frame my assessment, and I've highlighted the relevant provisions in underlining, and that's where I come to my, looking at those in the round and the whole. That's where I've come to my findings about the rural character being an important component of what we need to take into account. And just turning over to page 3 of that attachment, one of the particular provisions that sticks out for me and that is of importance is under the net environmental benefit provisions, RPROZP9 2. And 2A5 is talking about avoiding an urban form by encouraging small clusters of allotments. And I think that's quite a key part of the puzzle, really, that are we trying to avoid urban form in this particular zone, or is a little bit of urban form in a cluster, which could be argued that the applicant is proposing, is that appropriate? So that's quite a key provision that I've put into my mind when I've framed my assessment findings. So coming back to 4.11, and I'll let you get back to my other supplementary statements here.
Yes, I'm now back with you.
Back there. So third sentence in, if my assessment was undertaken without consideration of these framing statutory provisions, or if they anticipated a different outcome, I would likely conclude that the proposal would represent an entirely appropriate landscape outcome with associated positive effects, because it has been well considered and designed as I've recorded above. Alternatively, if the rural zoned portion of the development had more of a rural residential character, as the plan anticipates, might occur through the use of the environmental benefit provisions, and Mr. Hartstone will take you further into those, then that would also represent an appropriate landscape outcome, in my opinion. The existing site has rural character, and we've seen that in Mr. Farrow's photographs today. Clearly, the proposal as currently designed will result in some areas of the rural zoned part of the site becoming urban in character. I fully acknowledge that other areas within this part of the site will have enhanced landscape character while not being truly rural in character. And that's the revegetation of the steeper slopes of Hurupaki, the enhancement of the Waitoa stream corridor, and the provision of areas of public open space, albeit containing a stormwater attenuation pond. And I acknowledge there that Mr. Farrow's intention is to create those stormwater attenuation ponds as amenity features. But that's almost turning it into an urban park-like character rather than a rural character. But it's still open space rather than built up urban residential space. So it's complex. Additionally, in order to achieve the proposed outcomes, a reasonably extensive degree of earthworks will be required within this northern portion of the site, which will modify the existing natural landform in order to achieve the desired urban outcomes. And that's to create the vehicular access and to create that stormwater attenuation pond. From 4.14 onwards, this is where I sort of ran out of time to wordsmith it, but just to note the ONL and outstanding natural feature extent, there was some discussion with Mr. Farrow about the extent of that mapping and how it came about. And in my report at paragraph 20, I noted that in my opinion, the physical landform of Hurupaki extends to Waitoa Stream corridor as a landform feature, with that stream corridor creating a natural feature as the boundary between the two zones. And I just wanted to clarify that I wasn't suggesting that the mapping extent of the ONL and ONF was incorrect. It was really that the way that I read the land was that the slopes of Hurupaki do extend right down into that stream corridor for this particular site. And there's been some discussion today about the site, that northern part of the site being a pocket of rural land, when we've got the large lot residential to the west, and we've got the residential to the south of the stream, and the ONL to the north. Well, we've also got to the east the continuation of that rural land at the fringe of Hurupaki through to Dip Road. So it's not really an island of rural land. It's more of a skirt at the base of the volcanic cone around that southern to the southeastern part of that cone. 4.16 we've kind of talked about. Oh, sorry, 4.15 we're up to. The low density residential zone land to the west of the northern portion of the site is muddying the waters somewhat in the way we assess the landscape, and potentially is a bit of a zoning anomaly. Ms. McGrath has talked about how that came about, and I'll leave that to the planners to talk about further. But in my opinion, the proposal will create somewhat of a hard edge at that interface in terms of the urban, the more denser urban form that will be on that side on the site side of the fence compared to what might be realised on the western side of the fence. Maybe not being so consistent in character with each other. Again, we're speculating a little bit here because we don't know really what's going to happen next door. But I do acknowledge, as Mr. Farrow mentioned this morning, that the revegetation of the slopes, the steep slopes of Hurupaki on this site should and could well be encouraged to the west of the site, and that would achieve a far more appropriate outcome overall with the revegetation of that cone in the full extent. We've talked about 4.16 and the word avoid in the policies, and the fact that there's going to be a small component of urban in this rural landscape. And I just question, and that's a decision for you to make at the end of the day, is that an acceptable outcome? In my mind, the proposal, if granted consent, will effectively rezone part of the northern portion of the site through this application for resource consent from rural to urban. And so within the above context, I stand by my conclusions that the adverse landscape effects will be high, and I have used the same scale of effects which Mr. Farrow utilised in his assessment. So high is the same, in the same position on his scale of adverse effects. Thank you. Sorry, sir, you're on the mute again.
Thank you for the reminder. And I thank you for a respectful analysis of fellow landscape architects' statement of position. Respect the concessions you make, as I respect Mr. Farrow's concessions because he made some as well. Always difficult when you get professionals who come down different sides of the one argument. But as I said to Ms. Henderson, maybe that we're looking at a proposal here which is on a knife edge. Unfortunately for me, I'm the one that has to climb off the edge one way or the other.
Indeed.
If I do that, it's appropriate to hear from Mr. Hartstone, but even before that, Mr. Farrow, is there anything that you wish to ask Mr. Kensington to clarify?
I think something that I would find interesting is, or perhaps first I should also acknowledge Mr. Kensington's very generous and gentle approach, and note that it's quite unusual that we find ourselves in such diametrically opposed positions. But I think the aspect that's of most interest to me is Mr. Kensington's position on this concept of environment, in inverted commas, and how existing zoning patterns, which whilst possibly anomalous, do exist, and how that then shapes character and effect.
I think I have a pretty good handle on that issue, but if there's anything you want to add, Mr. Kensington, feel free.
I think for me, the zoning of that land to the west of the site as part of the existing environment is the one, as I said, it's muddying the waters somewhat. And we're almost crystal ball gazing a little bit to find out what would happen on that bit of land and how that would influence, you know, the assessment of what's happening on the proposed site. But it is, and I remember Mr. Farrow and I discussing this when we first started engaging over this particular proposal, is that, you know, if that had already been developed and we knew what was happening on that part of the site, part of the environment that's on the neighbouring property, it would make our lives a lot easier because we'd be able to contextualise it. But at the moment, we're kind of guessing about what's going to happen next door in order to inform what's going to happen on what should happen on this particular site. So it's very tricky, and I probably can't take it any further. Sorry, sir.
I understand that. I think we're probably taking that as far as we can at this point. We need to hear from Mr. Hartstone now because he will undoubtedly address some of the difficulties that you find yourself in.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Hartstone.
Yes, sir. I've just got the sun behind me and it's coming in the window and a bit annoying, so I'm shifting myself a little bit.
You look like you've got a halo.
I can assure you it's not. Sir, you're happy for me to proceed at this point?
Oh, yes, please.
Right. I'll perhaps just make a couple of initial comments about perhaps some of the more minor matters, if I can call them those. They may not be, of course. The first one was your question, sir, about the zoning of the block and the adjacent properties. And I certainly defer to Ms. McGrath's comments on that. She's lived and breathed those plan changes to her credit. They you know, were a big couple of projects, and she's managed those well. The only comment I would make, and I make this comment on the basis of having worn a different hat at a different time for the council. My understanding is the rural production zoning of the property we're discussing as it stands at the moment was the zoning that the council proposed as part of the district plan. There was no submission made by the owner at that stage to zone it to any other zone. Therefore, it remained as rural production. Now, if I understood Ms. McGrath's comments, the two properties, either one or both of those properties to the west that are now future urban zone and low density residential zone, that may have come about due to submissions. So that rural production zone, as I understand it, is what the council intended, and it was not challenged, and therefore it remained rural production zone. The other matter, sir, and like Peter, I acknowledge and respect the input from Ms. Henderson. That was quite interesting and very helpful in terms of context, particularly the cultural context of that site. I understood Ms. Henderson to make the comment that, if I can use, I understood she, but in the wider context, I suspect the family as mana whenua in that area would not support that walking track up to the Hurupaki Pa site. If I take the comment that Mr. Carpenter made earlier, that the Heritage New Zealand, if presented with an application for an authority to construct that walking track up to the Pa, if that application was presented, they would be looking for advice from mana whenua as to whether that track is appropriate. But certainly solely on the basis of Ms. Henderson's statement, there may not be support for such a track. Where that leaves that particular activity or proposed activity is perhaps something to consider at this point, particularly if we do, sir, get to a discussion around conditions. It may all obviously hinge on an authority from Heritage New Zealand, and noting that that reserve would vest, or is proposed to vest in the council, as I understand it. That brings me to I suppose from my point of view, and certainly based on the evidence and material that Ms. McGrath's presented, amongst others, the crux of the matter. And as a non-complying activity, we are looking at section 104D, and I really do think that is where perhaps we need to focus. In terms of my comments at this point, sir, I want to start by looking at the net environmental benefit provisions in the plan. The first comment I'd make is that there is a definition of net environmental benefit in the district plan. It sets out what constitutes a net environmental benefit. That term is not used anywhere in the subdivision rules in the rural production zone. That term, net environmental benefit, is referenced in the objectives and policies. So when we look at the objectives and policies, and I appreciate, sir, this is where the difficulty lies for you as a decision maker, and it is most unusual for Ms. McGrath and I to be to have opposing views, although she will appreciate I love a good debate, and we've probably debated various matters in the past, but it is unusual, and I certainly acknowledge that. What I would like to do, sir, is to walk through some of the policies and objectives that I've referred to in my report. Ms. McGrath's certainly done the same, but I wish to, I guess, address some of the comments that have been raised about cherry picking objectives and policies and the various themes, and the question of whether the proposal is contrary or repugnant to those provisions. And Sir Peter's alluded to it in his statement, and perhaps I'm just building on that. But one of the key themes in the rural production zone is an avoidance of urban form. And that theme effectively runs through most of the policies, some of which are very explicit. If I start with policy RPROZ-P1, rural character and amenity, that lists a number of characteristics that you're expecting to find in the rural production zone. That includes matters such as Clause C, a low intensity of development involving a combination of domestic and rural production, buildings and major structures. Clause G, generally low levels of vehicle traffic with seasonal fluctuations. So it also refers to a dominance of natural features, including landforms, watercourses and vegetation. That's acknowledged, certainly Mr. Kensington and I both acknowledge the importance of those landforms as part of the rural character, rural production zone, and there's no question about that. But that policy effectively sets the scene for the expectations around the rural character and amenity. If I go to policy RPROZ-P8, subdivision less than 20 hectares, clause 1 of that policy says it does not create a rural residential or rural lifestyle allotment other than where a net environmental benefit is achieved. The implication of that is you cannot create a rural residential or rural lifestyle allotment unless you do it by way of a net environmental benefit subdivision. A salient point there, sir, is the rules are structured in such a way that it specifies that the minimum lot size for a net environmental benefit subdivision is around 2,000 square metres. And I've taken that to be what would you call the minimum lot size for a rural residential lot. And that's obviously based on the structure of these provisions. If I refer to the next policy, which is RPROZ-P9, net environmental benefit, I think Peter Kensington and I are both in agreement, and there's no dispute, I would say, that clause 1 is met. A net environmental benefit is created by the legal protection in perpetuity, etc., and the information provided with the application covers off the net environmental benefit in that respect. The key here is that the precursor to that criteria for a net environmental benefit says that to protect and enhance biodiversity, landscapes, historic heritage and significant ecology, whilst protecting productive rural land resources, rural character and amenity by providing for subdivision where all of the following are achieved. the issue here, sir, is that under clause 2, the number, size and location of allotments, etc., in the rural production zone part of this development do not avoid an urban form. They are residential. They're serviced by reticulated services. They will be serviced by an urban road. I'm not sure that issue has been clearly traversed in the evidence that's been presented from the applicant or really addressed in any way other than by saying that that effect of any urban form will be offset or mitigated or more than compensated for by the net environmental benefit. And I think we need to acknowledge that there are two sides to this equation. One is the net environmental benefit. The other is the extent of development that you can expect in the zone having achieved a net environmental benefit. Obviously, Mr. Kensington's advice informs some of these comments as well, particularly in terms of the other clauses under point 2 of that policy, such as retaining rural character, natural character, landscape qualities and characteristics, rural character and amenity. My understanding is Mr. Kensington's view is that the effects on rural character and landscape, or certainly landscape in his statement provided this afternoon, are high or more than minor. RPROZ Policy 11, Location Design of Subdivisions and Associated Land Developments, again emphasises avoidance of urban form and character and to maintain rural character and amenity values and protect and enhance environmental features. There's no or in there, it's all and. All of those have to be achieved. And so I basically brings me to the comments in my 42A report under paragraphs 101, 102, 103, 104, and probably 105. The simple fact is the policies read together are quite clear that urban form should be avoided. And there's no obvious reconciliation that allows for residential development of an urban form where you achieve a net environmental benefit. And that's the issue that Mr. Kensington and I have grappled with since day one, and really is the reason why I've formed a view that the proposal is contrary to the plan provisions, and I don't believe the test under 104D1B can be met. You still with me, sir? Sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry, just run me that section number again, 104.
D.
Yeah.
1B.
So that's capital D1. That's it.
Sorry, sir, I'm conscious of a monologue droning on, but I think it's important to cover these points. Turning to section 104D1A, which is addressing the effects. Obviously, I'm relying on Mr. Kensington's findings that the effects on rural landscape will be high. And I think Mr. Kensington's taken the correct approach in informing his view based on what the objectives and policies set as an expectation for rural character and landscape. If I can just perhaps jump sideways a little bit, Mr. Farrow's asked that question about what is the environment and how does it shape the assessment of effects. We've all acknowledged the potential relevance of the surrounding zonings, excuse me, and we are presupposing what may occur to the west in terms of the future urban zone and the, I think it's large lot residential zone. I think the important thing to remember there, sir, is that subdivision in the large lot, perhaps I should make sure I get that zone name right. It's the low density residential zone, sorry, adjacent to the west. I've stated in paragraph 117 of my evidence that the minimum subdivision lot size in that zone is 2,000 square metres. That obviously corresponds with your minimum lot size for environmental benefit subdivision in the rural production zone. I think that's probably relevant. And in terms of the future urban zone, currently that minimum lot size is 1 hectare. I've said in my evidence that it could conceivably result in 500 square metre lots where all connections to reticulated services are provided to that property, but that's not existing at this point. So that just lends itself to the point that Mr. Kensington has made, that we're really presupposing or being quite hypothetical about what may occur on that property to the west. So sort of wrap that up in terms of section 104D. I guess I'm having some real issues reconciling what's proposed with meeting either of those gateway tests under 104.1D. Based on Mr. Kensington's evidence, we find the landscape effects are high or more than minor, and because there's a residential or urban form of development proposed in that rural production zone, where the provisions in the zone are directed towards avoiding an urban form or residential development, it seems very difficult to argue that the proposal is not contrary or repugnant to those provisions, because it is an urban form, and it will effectively be albeit a small residential area within the rural production zone. Perhaps just one or two other comments, sir, before I run out of steam. There's a couple of comments about the site being an island or a pocket or an enclave. Various terms have been used based on the zoning, and Mr. Kensington again has alluded to that. I don't think the layout of the zone boundaries makes this property any of those entities. Everything north of this site is rural production zone. It's not surrounded by a different zone. It's not encompassed by zones that allow for different intensity of development. I think the more correct approach is to recognise that the topography plays a big part in why this area is arguably separate from its surrounding environment, which is really what's being suggested, I think. The zoning is not of itself creating an island or an enclave or a pocket, and I've gone as far as looking at the zoning of properties on Manu Road, which is a reasonably comparable location, sir, and you may well be aware of where that is. And there are similar zone interfaces and similar situations with properties of similar size. For example, there are properties along Manu Road with a residential frontage, a rural production at the rear, and then Pukenui Forest encompassing it to the north, which is all dock estate. So I think the point I'm making is that the zoning is of itself not the issue that creates the isolation of this piece of land that results in it being an island or a pocket or an enclave. I think it's as much, if not more, the topography of the site. The last thing I'll probably just comment on, sir, is precedent, and I appreciate the legal counsel's advice regarding that matter. It's always a difficult one in my experience, because the courts seem to have a varying view on how relevant it is. all I can say is that in my experience in the court, it has been relevant and something that needs to be considered. I acknowledge that there are quite specific circumstances on this site in terms of the values that are involved, a volcanic cone, the stream in close proximity. I think I would just say to you, sir, that that is something that needs to be carefully considered, because up to a point, it is possible to replicate some of the features in terms of the zoning interface and potential to obtain a net environmental benefit, albeit not necessarily through a volcanic cone or a stream. It could be a wetland or some other feature. But in achieving a net environmental benefit, the next question is, what lots does that entitle you to? And I do wonder whether a grant of consent to this application might open the door, albeit slightly, for consideration of this net environmental benefit allows me to achieve an urban form of development where that's not provided for in the objectives and policies. So that's perhaps all I'll say about that, sir. In the time we have, it's probably all the analysis I can provide. I believe that's covered everything I need to address, sir. So I'm open to questions at this point.
I've used the term already on a knife edge. I think or evidence convinces me truly is a knife edge. I could write a decision either way, sure. However, I have to choose. And just for you to comment on, I'll fly a kite. Ms. McGrath and you and I have been involved in planning district for 4 years, and we probably care to remember. But at the end of the day, the kite is a decision to approve or a decision to decline, but get a decision. I'm sure in her right of reply, Ms. Lucas will give me chapter and verse as to how legally I can grant consent. You've given me some pretty solid material why legally and in the context of the planning instruments I cannot, should not grant consent. But if you put aside all the constraints and just say, is consenting or declining this application likely to result in better overall development long term? What would be your comments?
I think the only comment I would make, sir, is that Mr. Kensington and I had previous discussion with Ms. McGrath and Mr. Farrow and looked at a reduced intensity of development. that would align more with the rural residential expectation in the rules. And I think we would be entirely comfortable with that position. They have proceeded on the basis of what you've heard today, and so that's where it sits at the moment.
Okay, here's another kite. Section 104D spells out the gateway test, or provides the legislative framework. Section 104, subsection 1, subsection C says that the consent authority must have regard to any other matter the consent authority considers relevant and reasonably necessary to determine the application. Now that gives me a gateway. Sorry, I should use a different term. It gives me a doorway, not a gateway. And that could be argued to apply before assessing the gateway test, or it could be argued to be post the gateway test if that is satisfied, or it could be both. From your vast experience, are you able to help me at all by any comment on my analysis of the relevant legislative framework?
Are you asking the question as to whether 1041C sits before or after your assessment of 104D?
Now I'll ask Ms. Lucas that question.
Right.
What I'm asking you is, as a practicing planner of enormous experience, if you were faced with doing that, how would you approach it?
Well, I think I'm not entirely sure how to answer the question, sir, but we've had a good look at that in terms of what I've put into the 42A report. And in a case like this, there's possibly more that you can fit through that doorway than might normally be the case because of the circumstances. The problem I see is that even if you adopt some of those matters, and Sarah, you may even choose to adopt some other matters that you consider relevant and necessary to consider that I haven't turned my mind to, and that's entirely up to you. Whether that would extend to the net environmental benefit or whatever you wish to call it, positive effects, and where that weighs in the decision, I guess, is up to you. But I acknowledge, perhaps all I can say, Sue, is I acknowledge that doorway could be quite wide.
Thank you for that comment. And I think it's probably as far as I should press it, but simply in doing so, I note that I've emphasized something that I had not seen quite so clearly prior to hearing, and that is the importance of net environment as defined in the district plan. So I will go back and I'll have a close look at that, because as you say, it is very relevant.
It certainly prompted some discussions, sir, and make no bones about it, Mr. Kensington and I have gone backwards and forwards over this a great deal, which, if nothing else, is a sign of respect for Ms. McGrath and Mr. Farrow's expertise in these areas, and trying to understand, you know, where this sits in some of these provisions, and it's been quite difficult. Appreciate why you're on a knife edge.
Yes, well, thank you for that. And I hasten to point out for those who are listening and may not be aware of quite your role. Section 42A, reporting officer, is my principal source of advice. And so, are there any questions that anybody would want me to put to Mr. Hartstone in the light of everything that has taken place today? So raise your hand, please. It appears not. So, Ms. Lupus, I would appreciate hearing from you 2 points to go further. One is question of site visit, whether wish me to do a site visit, which to this point I have not, specific to this application, I mean. The second question is, I said earlier, I would welcome you for right of reply in writing. I'd go a step further than that, invite you, and even encourage you to put your right of reply in writing. And what motivates me, glad you asked, what motivates me is the very complex legal environment that we're talking about. Section 104, 104D, there's all the case law that surrounds that, but particularly whether in my decision making I may take into account that any other method prior to assessing the gateway test, or afterwards, or both, or neither.
Certainly not neither, sir.
Okay. It would be very helpful to me, though, to have a legal mind like yours help me with that framework for my decision making.
I'd be very happy to, sir, and I am already very encouraged to give you my comments in writing. So I'm glad we're on the same page about that. I was hoping to beg your leave to do exactly that. So I think we're settled and agreed on that point. As to the site, well, I should ask you how long you might give me for those comments is the next question. If I am to achieve a...
Would 10 working days sound?
That sounds perfect. It was going to line up with about my request. So that takes me on my diary either Thursday the 26th or Friday the 27th if you want to have them for the weekend. Friday the 27th.
Sounds a good time to me.
Perfect. On the question of a site visit, I had been speaking with some of the team about that earlier. I understand you're very familiar with the area, and so unless there was anything in particular that you wanted to see yourself on site, I do think that study by Mr. Farrow was very helpful in terms of what we would have asked you to turn your mind to look at physically in person. So unless you particularly want to see anything or something's troubling you, I would leave that to you. I wouldn't insist on one. Only if you wanted to bottom something out arising out of that study of the cone and the wider site.
When I was a young planner, many moons ago, I made a decision that I would never address a site development proposal as a consultant, let alone as a decision maker, without walking on the site. I have only broken that policy. Policies are made to have exceptions to, of course, but the number of exceptions that I have occurred, I could count on the fingers of one hand. However, given that policy was set prior to drones, prior to audio-visual hearings, and taking that into account and the very comprehensive evidence that we've heard, especially the photos and various perspectives from Mr. Farrow, I prepared to make an exception on this occasion with your consent.
I'm comfortable with that, sir.
Could I just ask Mr. Hartstone, would you also grant me that indulgence, please?
I'm sure that's fine, sir. You're suggesting you're not keen to come up and see us up here. It's unfortunate, but understandable.
Always keen to go to the windless north, but I am hesitant to do something which is not justified.
No.
In the
Fair enough.
So I think it would be imposing a cost upon whoever has to pay, which is unnecessary.
Yeah, sir, sorry, perhaps a slightly loaded question, but Ms. McGrath obviously spent a fair bit of time working on some draft conditions. Clearly setting aside where you may end up in terms of any sort of decision, do you believe there's any value in working on those in the meantime, or is that something you'll come to when you need, or if you need them?
Well, again, with Ms. Lucas's consent, I would suggest that you allow me a few days after I receive right of reply to make my decision in principle. Then give a few days, should not that decision in principle sent, for the conditions to be negotiated between the applicant himself and the hearing, meantime, remains open, and we close it when, in the event that I give the intention that I will grant consent. I close the hearing after a few days' time after that conditions to be found. Is that acceptable to you, Ms. Lucas?
I think that's very sensible, sir.
Okay with you, Mr. Hartstone?
Perfectly fine by me, sir. Yeah, not a problem.
Well, let's say 5 working days after the right of reply for me to issue decision in principle, A or nay. Then 5 working days after that to finalise conditions should my decision be in favour of the application.
That's fine, sir.
I'd be grateful, Ms. Lucas, if you would just remind me of that time frame when you provide your right of reply.
I will do so. I made a note. Thank you.
Good. You've been very helpful throughout. In fact, everybody has been incredibly helpful throughout. Is Ms. Henderson still online or not?
Yes, she is. Hello.
Kia ora, Ms. Henderson. I just want to add my acknowledgement alongside the others that have been given of your mana whenua status and your helpful input to this hearing. And Ms. Wilson, is there anything procedurally that you need me to do before I adjourn the hearing?
No, I don't think so. Yep, just as soon as it's adjourned, I just need to let everyone know that we will be uploading the recording from today's hearing onto the council website. Hopefully we'll get that uploaded tomorrow, just as the public record, and along with the fact that the meeting's been adjourned until the next update.
And can I assume you took a note of those timelines?
I did. Yep.
Perhaps you might put that up on the website as well, if you'd be so kind.
Absolutely, will do.
So, anybody got any procedural matter they wish to raise at this stage? There appears to be none, so it remains to think.
Oh, sorry.
Here we go.
Oh, we do.
Yeah.
Hello. I'd just like to say thank you. All right.
You're very
Thank
welcome.
you to everybody who's here today. All right.
I'm sure they will join me in thanking you also. So I will formally thank you all and adjourn according to the timetable that we have agreed. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much, sir. Good night.
Thank you. See ya.
Right.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you, bye.